The subcommittee will come to order, and good morning to everyone. Liu Xiaobo's premature death was a jarring shock to everyone who admired this champion of freedom and democracy. We mourn his loss because it is a tragic loss for his wife, family, and friends, and a catastrophic loss for China and really the entire world. We owe Liu Xiaobo a debt of gratitude because he demonstrated that the noble idea of democracy and due process, liberty, and the rule of law are not foreign ideas to China. They are universal principles that beat strongly in the hearts of people everywhere, from New Jersey to California to the Nineveh Plain to Iraq, from Poland to Peru, from Burma to Beijing. We owe Liu Xiaobo a debt of gratitude because he reminded us that the desire for democracy and human rights are shared by everyone, because each person is endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. The Chinese Communist Party has tried to curtail his ideas. They call them dangerous and subversive, and they seek to silence, censor, and repress them. Yet they live on in the hearts of untold millions of Chinese people. With Liu Xiaobo's death, we are also reminded of the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, who said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." We should all agree that what was done to Liu Xiaobo and his wife, Xia, was a grave injustice. Liu Xiaobo's imprisonment in 2009 became a death sentence. The blame for this should lie squarely on the Chinese government, and for his death, they alone should be held accountable. Liu Xiaobo was the first Nobel Peace Prize winner to die in state custody since Karl von Ossietzky died after being held in a Nazi concentration camp. 2 days ago, we heard the Chinese government complaining that it was stabbed in the back by those expecting it to deal quickly with its client state in North Korea. How shameful it is to play the victim card while a victim of their own repression lay dying. No nation should be judged entirely by crimes of the past, but this crime, the death and silencing of Liu Xiaobo, should follow the Chinese Communist Party like an unwashable permanent stain. We must never forget Liu Xiaobo's enduring contributions, whether during the Tiananmen massacre, where he helped save the lives of many students, or with Charter 08, the treaties urging political and legal reforms in China based on constitutional principles. We must not forget Liu Xiaobo. We must advance and preserve his legacy and repeatedly confront the Chinese Communist Party with his ideas and his memory. In this time of need, we must signal the Congress's unanimous support for Liu Xiaobo's family, his wife Xia, and all those bravely standing up for human rights and liberty in China. I was invited by Liu Xiaobo's family to attend the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. It was a moving ceremony. The now famous empty chair, and we have a photograph of that over on my right, speaks volumes of the Chinese Communist Party's abiding fear that human rights and democracy will undermine its power. I'll always remember the words of Liu Xiaobo's speech that day, of course not given in Oslo, about the importance of pressing for human rights. Freedom of expression, he said, is the foundation of human rights, the source of humanity, and the mother of truth. To strangle freedom of speech is to trample on human rights, stifle humanity, and suppress truth. He also expressed his hopes for China's future. He said, "I firmly believe that China's political progress will not stop, and I, Liu Xiaobo, filled with optimism, look forward to the advent of a future free China. For there is no force that can put an end to the human quest for freedom, and China will be, in the end, will become a nation ruled by law where human rights reign supreme." Liu Xiaobo will sadly never see a free China. Chinese authorities have gone to great lengths to stifle his ideas and those who followed him. In recent years, the government of President Xi Jinping has engaged in an extraordinary assault on the rule of law, human rights, ethnic minority groups, and civil society. As China's economic and military power grows, more and more countries will be afraid to raise subjects that the Chinese Communist Party wants to make taboo. The U.S. stands alone, inadequate as its efforts are at times, in its willingness to keep on raising human rights issues that need to be raised. The U.S. cannot lightly shrug off the mantle of being democracy's defender. no matter how heavy that mantle may become. It is tempting to be pessimistic about China's future and the future of U.S.-China relations. But I'm not pessimistic, and taking a cue from Liu Xiaobo, none of us should be. Constant repression has not dimmed the desires for the Chinese people for freedom and reform, and of course that's attributed to the great work of Liu Xiaobo. Nevertheless, the U.S. cannot be morally neutral or silent in the face of the Chinese government's repression of fundamental freedoms. Human rights is not a secondary interest, but one critically linked to all issues in China, including U.S. economic and security interests. The U.S. must not shy away with meeting with China's other Nobel laureate, the Dalai Lama, or other dissidents. We must use congressionally authorized sanctions to hold Chinese officials accountable for torture and gross abuses, including those prescribed in the International Religious Freedom Act and, of course, the Global Magnitsky Act. We must connect Internet and press freedoms as both economic and human rights priorities, and we must demand repeatedly and clearly that unconditional release of political prisoners is in the interest of a better U.S.-China relationship. I believe that someday China will be free. Someday the people of China will be able to enjoy all of their God-given rights. And a nation of free Chinese women and men will honor and celebrate Liu Xiaobo as a hero. He will be honored along with others like him who have sacrificed so much and for so long for freedom. I yield to my distinguished ranking member, Karen Bass.
I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. I extend my condolences to Liu Xiaobo's family and friends on his recent passing. Chairman Smith, you've long been a champion, as demonstrated by your actions over the years and today. The loss of Liu Xiaobo has once again brought attention to the issues of human rights in China. Tragically, his imprisonment and passing is a reminder of the importance of monitoring the treatment of those who have been imprisoned or who have lost their lives fighting for freedom. Freedoms like the freedom of religion, speech, press, and the right of people to peacefully assemble, as well as the often implied freedom of association. Central to those freedoms is the freedom to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Liu Xiaobo spent the final months of his life appealing to the Chinese government to allow him to leave China to receive cancer treatment, and even in his final request, he was denied. He could have lived a quiet life as an academic, a scholar, a writer, but instead he decided to challenge the status quo and actively engage in efforts for democratic reform. He leaves behind the embers of democratic principles that will be fanned by generations to come. I yield.
Thank my good friend for her comments. I'd like to now recognize our very distinguished panel, beginning with Yang Jiangli, who was born in Shandong Province in northern China and graduated from college at the age of 19. A rising star in the Chinese Communist Party, Yang Li quickly became disenchanted by the corruption and duplicity he witnessed in the communist system. He left China to pursue a career at mathematics at UC Berkeley. In 1989, at the age of 26, his fellow graduate students at Berkeley elected him to go back to Beijing in support of their counterparts in China who were demonstrating for democracy in Tiananmen Square. After escaping the gruesome massacre, he dedicated his entire life in promoting a peaceful democratization. He received his PhD in mathematics from USC Berkeley, but of real significance, or of significance, of course, when he returned to China in 2002, he was put in prison for 5 years. Upon his release, he founded Initiatives for China, so he knows the inside of a gulag, and we thank him for being here, especially with the loss of his brother-in-law, and he will be going to that funeral right after here. He wanted to be here so badly. We'll then hear from Jared Gensler, the founder of Freedom Now and managing director of Persis Strategies. Previously, Jared was a partner in the government affairs at Piper. He is a visiting fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. His human rights clients have included Václav Havel, Aung San Suu Kyi, Liu Xiaobo, Desmond Tutu, Elie Wiesel. He holds a B.S. from Cornell and a Master's in Public Policy from John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He got his J.D. cum laude from University of Michigan Law School, and author of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, Commentary and Guide to Practice, and he's a co-editor of The Responsibility to Protect, the Promise of Stopping Mass Atrocities in Our Times. And I want to thank him for his tenacious leadership for Liu Xiaobo and other wonderful and leading dissidents around the world. Then we'll hear from Perry Link, who is Professor Emeritus of East Asian Studies at Princeton University and Chair for Teaching Across Disciplines at the University of California at Riverside. He has published widely on modern Chinese language, literature, and popular thought. As a member of the Princeton China Initiative, Human Rights Watch Asia, and other groups that support human rights, he has authored among many, many books, and he has has testified here in the past as well. And because of time, without objection, all of your full resumes will be made part of the record. I'd like to go to Dr. Yang.
Chairman Smith and ranking members, I had a sleepless night. At this grievous moment, I would like to thank you for holding this critical hearing. It is critical for us to discuss how we can still lend a helping hand to assist Liu Xiaobo and his family, and how we can fight to honor the legacy of his courage and sacrifice. Liu Xiaobo's tragedy represents the tragedies of many human rights activists in China, but it is also unique in its own way. In all of the Nobel Peace Prize history, there have only been 3 jailed laureates, but among them, Liu Xiaobo is the most tragic one. Liu Xiaobo had been held incommunicado since December 2008, until he became terminally ill and was eventually allowed a visit by a German doctor and an American doctor after the pleas to Xi Jinping from both President Trump and German Chancellor Merkel. During his entire imprisonment, he was not allowed even to talk about any current events with his wife, Liu Xia, during her visit, nor the persecutions Liu Xia and her family suffered. Even on his deathbed, he had no freedom to leave his last words. Now that he's gone, the world will never know. Liu Xiaobo's cancer was diagnosed on May 23rd during an emergency hospital visit because of internal bleeding. And since then, he had been hospitalized in the first hospital of China Medical University in Shenyang, Liaoning province. However, the news of his late-stage cancer was not leaked out until the late June. During this time, his tumor enlarged from 5 to 6 cm to 11 to 12 cm. It is reported that Liu Xiaobo had 2 CT tests last year. How can two tests fail to reveal Xiaobo's fairly large liver cancer tumors? Many, including myself, suspect that the Chinese officials intentionally conceal this information. This is why they have been withholding his medical records. These records are classified as top state secret. I strongly believe that Chinese regime deliberately chose not to treat Liu Xiaobo's cancer earlier. As early as 2010, Liu Xiaobo was suspected of suffering from hepatitis B. His lawyers had been petitioning the government to grant him medical parole, but the Chinese authorities never allowed him proper diagnosis and treatment. In China, it is not doctors, but the party officials to decide whether to grant medical parole. In other words, medical parole in China is a political, not a medical decision. In Liu Xiaobo's case, it was up to China's top leaders to decide. The denial of medical care led to Liu Xiaobo's advanced liver cancer, and at its core was a disguised death sentence. When Liu Xiaobo's worsening condition became public, human rights activists, 150 Nobel laureates and world leaders called for Liu Xiaobo's immediate release and medical treatment overseas. Liu Xiaobo himself also expressed his wish to seek medical treatment abroad and to die in a free place. Unfortunately, the Chinese regime carelessly disregarded this request. After persecuting him for so many years, the regime still did not even hesitate to crush his final wish. I believe the reason that the Chinese regime denied Liu Xiaobo's wish and the world's appeal to allow him medical treatment abroad and to die in a free place is that it fears that the truth of its ruthless persecution will come to light. The world media would focus on Liu Xiaobo, and the regime's lies would be exposed. More and more people in China would see the true nature of this one-party state. The government would lose control. No doubt, the Chinese Communist regime is responsible for Liu Xiaobo's death. However, the world democracy's appeasement policy towards China human rights abuses has made them accomplices of Liu Xiaobo's slow murder. If the world continues to acquiesce to China's aggression against its own people, engaging it without any moral clarity, Liu Xiaobo's strategy will repeat. Mr. Chairman, the U.S. can and should do more to help Liu Xiaobo and his family. We should urge the Trump administration to make it a high priority to urge China to grant Liu Xia full control over any funeral arrangement for his late husband, and to help Liu Xia to leave China for a country of her choosing. U.S. should implement country-specific and tougher sanctions against those personally responsible for Liu Xiaobo's death. The U.S. should use Global Magnitsky Act as a tool to sanction them, banning them from traveling in the U.S. and freezing their assets in this country, and also encourage its allies to do the same. It should also consider trade sanctions. In addition, the U.S. can honor Liu Xiaobo's life and legacy by passing legislation to permanently rename the street in front of China's embassy in Washington, D.C. as Liu Xiaobo Plaza. To fight for the ideals of human rights and democracy, Liu Xiaobo gave up his career, he gave up his freedom, and now he has given up his life. But we cannot give up on him. We have to seek justice for his death at the hands of the Chinese regime. And we have to preserve the legacy of Liu Xiaobo's struggle for democratic, free China. Thank you.
Dr. Yang, thank you for your eloquent and moving and enlightened recommendations and testimony. Mr. Genser.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass. It is with a heavy heart and after a tragic day yesterday that I appear before you this morning. Undoubtedly, Yang Zhongli and Perry Link, who were friends with Liu Xiaobo, will be able to bring to life who he was as a person and will be able to speak better than me to his life and to his legacy. Sadly, I never met Liu Xiaobo, and now I never will. The intersection of my life with Liu Xiaobo came only after he'd been convicted and sentenced to 11 years in prison for inciting subversion of state power. I was introduced to Liu Xia by my friend and colleague Yang Zhongli. It was Zhongli, among many others, who 20 years ago inspired me to become a human rights lawyer as we helped organize the protests against Jiang Zemin when he visited Harvard in the fall of 1997. And 5 years later, I served as Zhongli's lawyer when he was detained in China and faced a death sentence on the pretextual charge of being a spy for Taiwan. It was in mid-2010 that I was introduced by Zhongli to Liu Xia. What I can uniquely speak about today, however, is the brutality of the Chinese government and its fear of change. For I have seen through the intense and unrelenting persecution of Liu Xiaobo and Liu Xia some of the most horrific, callous, and inhuman acts that go beyond the power of an ordinary and normal person's power of imagination. Over the summer of 2010, I got to know Liu Xia as we began preparing to take her husband's case to the United Nations. As the announcement of the Nobel Peace Prize approached that year, it was rumored he was on the short list, and Liu Xia and I discussed if it made more sense for her to travel abroad to fight for her husband's freedom or to remain in China. Despite the concerns I expressed to her that she would not likely remain free if Liu won the prize, she told me unequivocally, quote, "My place is in China with my husband." Shortly after he was announced as the recipient of the prize in October of 2010, the security cordon came down and she was placed under house arrest, and she has been held without charge or trial ever since. I had the tremendous privilege and honor to represent the Lius in Oslo and to sit in the front row as the prize was presented to the empty chair. But I know, and I knew on that day, that the prize was awarded, that getting them both out would be a virtually impossible task. For myself, while I expected her ability to communicate or travel to be restricted, I never could have imagined how much the Chinese government would punish Liu Xia for the crime of being married to her husband. She was held in a one-bedroom apartment in Beijing, one of the most popular cities in the world, and for the first several years, virtually incommunicado, with a security guard posted outside of her door and security at the front of the building to turn people away. She had no telephone, no internet access, and was only able to see her parents once a month, and was taken to see Liu Xiaobo once a month. She suffered severe depression and had a heart attack. On a handful of occasions, journalists broke through the security cordon and captured brief images of her, clearly in intense agony. To punish her for these incidents, the Chinese government prosecuted her brother, Liu Hui, on bogus economic crimes charges and sentenced him to 11 years in prison, and he served some 2 years plus in jail. She was captured by one journalist as she was taken to his trial, crying out, "Tell the world I'm not free." In her latter years under house arrest and with her own health deteriorating rapidly, she was allowed to be in touch with a very small number of friends, but the pressure on her was unrelenting. We don't know anything at all, about how Liu Xiaobo has been treated in prison. The last time he said anything that was reported publicly was when he was sentenced to prison in December of 2009. All we know is that he was held in extended solitary confinement throughout this time, which constitutes torture under international law. And we know that Liu Xia was able to visit him monthly, and we know that with all of its resources at the disposal of the Chinese government, it neglected his medical care so much so that it had no idea he had liver cancer until it had reached stage 4 and was terminal. As the Liu's counsel, I fought their cases aggressively in every forum that I could find. We took their cases to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and in response to our submission, the Chinese government remarked regarding Liu Xia's detention, regarding her Kafkaesque existence, that she was, quote, under no legal restriction. That was perhaps actually literally true. She had been held actually illegally, without charge or trial, now for almost 7 years. The UN found that they were both held arbitrarily and in violation of international law. We secured a letter from 134 Nobel laureates urging President Xi to let them go, which was joined by 450,000 people around the world whose petitions we had delivered to a half-dozen Chinese embassies. And we published countless op-eds, testified before parliaments, held candlelight vigils, and did everything possible to persuade governments around the world to act. In the last few weeks, we have seen President Xi and the Chinese government at its worst. First, the Lius were pressured not to tell anyone about Liu Xiaobo's cancer diagnosis. Second, when they were able to make it public, they were held virtually incommunicado at the hospital. Third, the Chinese government flagrantly lied about his conditions to the international community to justify him not being able to travel abroad for medical treatment. Fourth, after a German and American doctor found he would have actually been able to travel abroad and there were treatments that could have extended his life for several weeks, the Chinese hospital published a statement asserting that the doctors those foreign doctors had actually said that he got an excellent care and was too sick to travel abroad. Once the foreign doctors put out their own statement refuting what the Chinese hospital said, the government retreated back to telling the international community not to interfere with his internal affairs. And fifth, as if Liu Xiaobo and Liu Xia had not suffered enough, in his dying days, not only were family and friends denied the ability to visit and to tell him goodbye, but they were never even allowed to be alone with each other. The entire time, a Chinese security official was with them around the clock. And in the end, President Xi showed no humanity and no mercy. If this is how China treats its most famous political prisoner, it is self-evident that the brutality of the Chinese government in repressing its own population is as complete as it is unapologetic. Truly, anything can be justified in the name of the greater good. Yet despite the tragedy that Liu's freedom has come from his death, it is clear today that the Chinese government has lost. Liu's ideas and his dreams will persist, spread, and will one day come to fruition. And his courage and his sacrifice for his country will inspire millions of Chinese activists and dissidents to persevere until China has become the multi-party democracy that Liu knew to its core was within its people's grasps. So what do we do from here? The work is clearly not done in so many different respects. First and most immediately, the world must rescue Liu Xia. She must immediately be allowed to have open communication with the outside world, and her wishes for the burial of her husband and relocation of herself and her family must be fully honored. Given she is under, quote, no legal restriction, this should be easy to achieve. Second, the world must never forget Liu Xiaobo and what he stood for. I would urge all freedom-loving countries around the world, starting with the United States, to rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy Liu Xiaobo Plaza. The Chinese government is literally erasing him from existence in China. If you type his name in Chinese in the WeChat program online, for example, his name is instantly erased. The Chinese government should never be allowed to forget Liu Xiaobo. And finally, the best way to honor the legacy of Liu Xiaobo would be for the United States and so many other countries around the world to stand in solidarity with the Chinese people's struggle for freedom, democracy, and human rights. As I noted before, the last time the world heard from Liu was in a statement released by his counsel on December 25, 2009, right after he was sentenced to 11 years imprisonment. Liu said, quote, "I have long been aware that when an independent intellectual stands up to an autocratic state, step one towards freedom is often a step into prison. Now I am taking that step, and true freedom is that much nearer." It is tragic that Liu was only free when his soul left his body, but the legacy he left behind will never be forgotten. Thank you.
Mr. Genser, thank you very much. Dr. Link.
Join my fellow witnesses in congratulating Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, Representative Swozey, and everyone on this committee, not only for this session, but for the many sessions you've done in the past, and I hope will continue to do in the future. They truly are important. In order to challenge a repressive regime like the one in China today, a regime that demands comprehensive control of society and resorts to extreme brutality if it perceives a threat to itself, a person needs to make a judgment that speaking the truth is more important than personal safety. Dozens of Chinese in recent decades have accepted those stakes, have persisted in speaking honestly in public, and have suffered dire consequences. Liu Xiaobo stood out within this courageous group because of his truly unusual determination. He went to prison 4 times, yet none of the punishments deflected him in the slightest from his view of the truth or from his willingness to express it. 3 related events during the years 2008 to 2000.
Dr. Link, your mic's off. These are working.
They're out too.
Ours are working. Why don't you come right up here then? And oh, good. Sorry. I haven't been elected. No.
Is this working now? Yes. Liu Xiaobo stood out within this courageous group because of his truly unusual determination. He went to prison 4 times, yet none of the punishments deflected him in the slightest from either his view of the truth or from his willingness to express it. 3 related events during the years 2008 to 2010 turned him into China's most prominent dissident. One was his sponsorship of the Citizens' Manifesto called Charter 08, which is the only public document since the Communist Revolution in 1949 that calls for an end to one-party rule. Second is the 11-year prison sentence that was the consequence of having worked on that charter. And third was the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize, which came as a consequence of the prison sentence. So you can see there's a chain of causality there. Intellectually, Liu was one of those unusual people who can look at human life from the broadest of perspectives and reason about it from first principles. His keen intellect noticed things that others only look at but don't see. He was deeply erudite on a variety of topics in history and literature, both Eastern and Western, ancient and modern. His remarkable habit of writing free from fear was so natural and routine that it seemed almost genetic, almost something that he himself could not stop. Most Chinese writers today, including many of the best ones, write with political caution in the backs of their minds and with a shadow hovering over their fingers as they pass across a keyboard. How should I couch things? What topics should I not touch? What indirection should I use? Liu Xiaobo did none of this. With him, it was all there. What he thought.
Hello?
Okay. Yeah. The combination of Charter 08 and the Nobel Prize seemed, for a time, to open an alternative for China, a new alternative. Chinese citizens had long been accustomed to the periodic alternations between more liberal, so-called, and more conservative, so-called, tendencies within communist rule, as if those limits described how far one could think. But Charter 08 removed the blinkers and showed that there could be another way to be a modern Chinese. It was hard to find Chinese people who disagreed with the charter once they read it. And this potential for contagion was clearly the reason why the regime suppressed it. Today, as the severe tightening of controls on Chinese society that has come during the last few years under the rule of Xi Jinping has pushed China in the opposite direction from what the charter stood for. And the question therefore arises, is the charter dead? Was the effort in vain? This question is difficult, but my answer would be no. The movement has been crushed, but its ideas have not been. The government's assiduous, unremitting, and very expensive efforts to repress anything that resembles the ideas in Charter 08 is evidence enough that the men who rule are quite aware of the continuing potential of the ideas to spread. Liu Xiaobo has been compared to Nelson Mandela, Václav Havel, and Aung San Suu Kyi, each of whom accepted prison as the price for conceiving and pursuing more humane governance in their homelands. But Mandela, Havel, and Suu Kyi all lived to see release from the beastly regimes that repressed them, and Liu Xiaobo did not. Does this mean his place in history will fall short of theirs? Is success of a movement necessary in order for its leader to be viewed as heroic? Perhaps so. It may be useful, though, to compare Liu Xiaobo and China's President Xi Jinping for a moment. The two men differ in age by only 2 years. During Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, both missed school and were banished to remote places. Xi Jinping used the time to begin building a resume that would allow him, by riding the coattails of his elite communist father, to vie one day for supreme power. Liu Xiaobo used the same time to read on his own and learn to think for himself. One of them mastered the skullduggery and sycophancy that a person needs in order to rise within a closed bureaucracy. The other of them learned to challenge received wisdom of every kind, keeping for himself only the ideas that could pass the test of rigorous independent examination by himself. For one of them, value was measured by power and position. For the other, by moral worth. Today, after their final standoff, one of them has won, quote unquote. The other has lost, quote unquote. But 200 years from now, who will remember the names of the tyrants who sent Mandela and Havel and Suu Kyi to jail? Will the glint of Liu Xiaobo's incisive intellect be remembered, or the cardboard mediocrity of Xi Jinping's? I have just a few extra comments on his final days. Before Liu Xiaobo died of liver cancer in a prison ward in a Shenyang hospital, he asked for safe passage for himself, his wife, and his brother-in-law to go to Germany or the US. The two Western governments agreed, but the Chinese government, saying Liu was already receiving the best possible medical care and was too weak to travel, did not. Until then, Liu had always rejected suggestions that he leave China, primarily because dissidents who leave China lose credibility back home. Moreover, Liu had made it his personal mission to show exactly what happens, right to the last detail, when an independent thinker confronts an authoritarian regime. We do not know why he changed his position in his last few days, but we can guess at the reasons, and I have two guesses. One is the obvious one, that he was critically ill and transfer abroad might have been the only chance, however slight, to save his life. Second, and I think this is really the more likely, he knew that his death was imminent and wanted to spend the last of his energies to help his beloved and long-suffering wife, Liu Xia, who has been held under house arrest for the last 7 years, even though formally charged with nothing, and who has had bouts of severe depression. But if Liu's reasoning cannot be known, and now it cannot be, there can be no doubt whatever about the reasoning of his captors. Their concerns had little to do with medical care, one way or the other, and much to do with preventing Liu Xiaobo from speaking his mind one last time. What did he see as he lay dying for a world in which China's beastly dictatorship continues to grow? Sealed in eternity.
Dr. Link, thank you so very much for that eloquent and heartfelt message. We are privileged on the subcommittee to be joined by Leader Nancy Pelosi, who has been tenacious in her advocacy for Liu Xiaobo and other dissidents in the People's Republic of China. I'd like to yield any time, such time as you'd like to consume.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It is such a sad day for all of us. We were so hopeful that we could have seen an opportunity for medical care to be given to Liu Xiaobo in the last days of his life, to extend his life, the life of this great man. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your ongoing, consistent, persistent advocacy for human rights throughout the world, in particular in this case in China. You and I have worked on these issues for decades. Your staff said to me, you're now sitting on the Republican side. When it comes to these issues, there's no side. We have always worked in a very strong bipartisan way, and I have always saluted your leadership, as well as our colleague Frank Wolf from Virginia, who was also very relentless. I have seen Dr. Yang's testimony and Mr. Ganser's testimony, and heard Dr. Link's beautiful statement as well. I just wanted to make a statement for the record. I just was being interviewed by, over in the Capitol, by, for a statement on this. What I partially said was, the world grieves the loss of Liu Xiaobo, one of the great moral voices of our time. His clarion call for democracy and human rights in China represented the best hopes of humankind. His courage became a poignant symbol for freedom-loving people across the globe. Liu Xiaobo's death is a tragedy and a deep affront to the basic notions of justice and human dignity. The role that poor medical care in prison played in his death, and the cruelty of confining a dying man in captivity away from his family and friends should disturb us all. His arrest for the so-called crime of putting his political views into writing is a sobering reminder of China's shameful disregard for basic freedoms. The world is a bleaker place for this crushing loss, but we must continue to carry forward Liu Xiaobo's legacy. America must honor its moral duty to speak out in defense of the many journalists, human rights lawyers, democracy advocates, and religious freedom advocates unjustly and unfairly lost in jail, simply for aspiring to a more free and hopeful future. If we do not speak out for human rights in China because of commercial interest, 2 weeks ago, I was pleased to join Congressman Chris Smith, co-chair of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, as the House overwhelmingly passed a bipartisan resolution calling for the unconditional release of both Liu Xiaobo and his wife Liu Xiao. We strongly hope that China would heed the call to free Liu Xiao for unjust house arrest and will allow her to travel wherever she may choose. I just want to join Dr. Link in his comments about Liu Xiao, reading from Liu Xiaobo's Nobel lecture in absentia on December 10th, 2010. He said in this, "If I may be permitted to say so, the most fortunate experience of these past 20 years has been the selfless love I received from my wife, Liu Xiao. She could not be present as an observer in the court today." He was talking about the court. "But I want to say to you, my dear, that I firmly believe your love for me will remain the same it has always been. Your love, more things, but your love is the sunlight that leaps over high walls and penetrates the iron bars of my prison window, stroking every inch of my skin, warming every cell of my body, allowing me to always keep peace, openness, and brightness in my heart. Even if I were crushed into powder, I would still use my ashes to embrace you." I think that he has given us our direction. We must work very hard to protect Liu Xiao, hopefully to bring her and brother-in-law of Liu Xiaobo out of China. I'll take my guidance from Chairman Smith. We talked about a number of ways to honor the memory of Liu Xiaobo and to honor his love of his wife. I'm particularly happy that Congresswoman Karen Bass is with us today. She is a person who respects the dignity and worth of every person. She works hard for children in our own country and a supporter of the dignity and worth of people throughout the world. Thank you, Congresswoman Bass, for making this a priority for us. And again, under your leadership, Mr. Chairman, you'll give me some guidance as to what you think the best path is to go. But I'll close by saying, may Liu Xiaobo's life and legacy continue to inspire all who strive for justice and democracy. May his memory be a blessing to us all, and may his family take some solace in knowing that the whole world mourns with them. And Dr. Link, I don't think it's going to take 200 years. I think right now and very soon, the contribution, the legacy of Liu Xiaobo will certainly eclipse the authoritarians of China. With that, I thank the chairman and yield back.
Leader Pelosi, thank you very much for your eloquent
statement. I'm honored that the chairman is.
And we are joined by full committee chairman, distinguished Ed Royce. Mr. Royce.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much, and Leader Pelosi. It's a sad day. Yesterday was a very sad day. A sad day for human rights. I was deeply saddened to learn of Nobel Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo's tragic passing. I think the world mourns. Our thoughts are with his loved ones, especially his widow, Liu Xia, who has been under house arrest now since 2010. Liu was a prolific writer. He was an academic. He dedicated his life to giving voice to the oppressed. And he did this by calling for his government to grant more freedom to the Chinese people. He was imprisoned multiple times, and he was imprisoned for his peaceful protests for human rights and for democracy in China. It happened first during Tiananmen Square in 1989, and later for releasing the Charter 08 Manifesto in 2009, which articulated the need for reforms in China. Those reforms, it was his intent, would achieve the rule of law, would achieve freedom of press and speech and religion. He was an inspiration to all of us. Liu's efforts were not in vain. His sacrifice and death, while in the custody of the Chinese government, while serving an unjustified 11-year prison sentence, has shined a light on the sad state of human rights in China. As we take stock of these sad events, we should remember that there are prisoners of conscience in China and around the world who continue to need our support. Let us be part of his legacy. May the bravery of Liu Xiaobo inspire us to seek their freedom also. And thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Royce. And again, thank you, Leader Pelosi. We were together in Oslo, and what an honor. And what a heartbreak this is. This hopefully, Liu Xiaobo's death will be a global pivot to human rights in China, and we certainly have to do our part in doing that. Mr. Swazi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we're very rushed for time because we have to go over for votes, but I just wanted to say, Dr. Yang, my condolences to you. Mr. Genzer and Dr. Link, thank you so much for your life's work and for your testimony as well. It's hard to imagine when we're in this air-conditioned room that's so august and in this setting to think of the suffering that went on in his life and now goes on in his wife's life and in so many other people's lives, from cancer to depression and heart attacks and suffering. And this is going on all over the world right now, and people who are trying to fight for human rights and fight for human dignity throughout the world. And his life is such an inspiration to me, and I know to so many others. And we are so grateful to all of you for helping to bring notice to this important message. You know, China right now is trying to participate in the modern world through its economy, but economic improvement is not a substitute for respect for human dignity and human rights. And I want the chairman to know, and the ranking member to know, and the leader to know that I'll do everything I can to work with them to support efforts to make sure that this life was not a life in vain. So thank you so much for everything that you do. Sheshe.
Thank you. We'll take a brief recess. We have votes on the floor. It's actually on zero, so we're going to have to run, but we'll be right back.
So he has two. So he has this one, and he has one to rename the street in Liu Xiaobo Plaza in front of the Chinese embassy.
Oh.
And
That's a good one.
yeah, yeah. In fact, there was some talk after Liu Xiaobo passed away about moving the hearing to the outside the Chinese embassy, but then someone checked the weather forecast and how humid it would be, and yeah, just couldn't find a bullhorn and all that. So thankfully, yeah, we didn't do that.
Yeah.
But
well, it's good you guys at least got the big hearing room. I feel like normally we're in that tiny room inside.
Yeah, it varies when we, but it's some algorithm, that takes into account how much publicity we get, who gets the request in first, and
so there's Friday, so the
yeah.
being used.
That's like our Ebola hearings that we had when we were in. It was a few years ago. There was the African Leader Summit, and it was in August. So we were in recess, but Smith and Bass were here as committee chairman and ranking member for the summit, and that was also when Ebola was big news. So we had the first of turned out to be, I think, 4 hearings on Ebola, the Ebola crisis, and this was the only thing that was on. So we had no problem with C-SPAN then because they had nothing else going on because everyone else is in recess. But do you know Jared Genser?
No.
Jared's
the guy in the purple suit talking with Eddie?
Yep. Yeah.
Who is he?
He's sort of a big human rights attorney. He's like celebrity folks. He partners often with Amal Clooney on human rights issues. Jared Genser.
Was he? Oh, okay. I mean, I probably
We can go down.
should have, read all these people's testimonies before I came down.
Yeah, it's tough to.
I mean, I feel like
We just
for
got them
me-
yesterday.
I feel like for me too, I can't give anything as much attention as I want to because I have just too much stuff.
Oh, it's
I have
ridiculous.
aviation, maritime, tax, financial services, HVAC,
Oh, it's ridiculous.
and I'm just
yeah. I can't.
completely over my head all the time. I'm here till like 8 or 9 almost every day.
Yeah.
And I think also there's then you compound that with that we're a freshman office and Mr. Swazi is still I'm new and I don't know him, so I can't I don't know him well enough to wing stuff without really talking to him about things. Make sure I get his style and his voice and his views, because he has some views that don't go with the party, so I need to make sure that I'm not just like, oh well, of course he's. I think one of the classic New York Dems that he's for lower taxes and all that stuff, but.
Well, he was. Yes. No, I've known. In fact, he was one of the few Democrats. Well, we're in the same
I remember
town in
saying,
Italy, and
so I can't just be like, okay, well the caucus says this, so he's going to do it.
No,
he has his own way of thinking.
Yeah,
so I'm still learning.
He's a good man. He was one of the few Democrats I've actually written checks for governor. The idea was that Schumer and Spitzer were going to run for governor, and they would sort of split the liberal
early 60s. I need to unmute the system. Can you? I'm going to turn this.
Want me to turn off?
I can hear you.
Testing, testing. Checking 1, 2, checking microphone 1, 2, 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Testing microphone 1, 2, 1, 2. Test, test 1, 2, 3, 4. Checking microphone 1, 2, 1, 2. Check microphone. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing microphone. Nothing. Testing 1, 2. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing microphone 1, 2, 3, 4. Test. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing microphone 1, 2, 3, 4. Better now? Okay.
There you go. The subcommittee will resume its sitting, and Dr. Yang, I know you do have to go to the funeral of your brother-in-law, and again, my greatest sympathies to you and your family, but please.
Yep, I have a few further points to make, then I can leave. Yep. Mr. Chairman, Liu Xiaobo represents the best of what China can be in death as well as in life. He possesses a moral authority that his persecutors can only envy. His legacy of love, justice, and courage will surely far outlive the deeds of those who persecuted him. Liu Xiaobo was a major leader of the 1989 democracy movement. He shouldered moral and political responsibility after Tiananmen Square, continued to fight inside China for its constitutional democracy while many left the country and even left the movement. He shared the suffering of his compatriots and made great sacrifices for them. He is a saint. His spirit will be uplifting and a unifying force that will inspire more people of China to fight to realize his dream, indeed, the common dream of Chinese people. To the world, he represents the universal values that all democracy embrace and the unwavering struggle of unfree people for freedom. Liu Xiaobo is a representative of ideas that resonate with millions of people all over the world. But it is a sad and disturbing fact that many leaders of the free world, who themselves hold democracy and human rights in high regard, have been less willing to stand up for those rights for the benefit of others. If this became a widely accepted fashion and continued, the democratic way and the security of the free people would eventually in jeopardy. Today, I cannot help asking, what kind of a government would refuse to grant the final wish of such a peaceful, kind man as Liu Xiaobo, a man who sincerely believes that he has no enemies, to die as a free man, to die with dignity? What kind of a government would not even allow him the last moment of being with his beloved wife without surveillance? This is a totally morally bankrupted regime. Dealing with such a regime, one must have a moral clarity. There are a lot of talking about engaging with China. Yes, no one can avoid engaging with China, but democracies must engage China comprehensively. Democracies must engage this brutal face of this regime and must not look the other way when human rights tragedies take place. The Chinese government can never be considered a true trusted peer on the global stage until they address their egregious human rights violations. The tragic passing of Liu Xiaobo gave us a stronger sense of urgency to help other dissidents. I'm afraid that more human rights activists will languish and disappear in China's prisons. Wang Bingzhang, Hu Shigen, Zhu Yufu, Ilham Tohti, Tashi Wangqiu, Wang Quanzhang, Jiang Tianyong, Tian Jingling, Wu Gan, Guo Feixiong, Liu Xianbing, Chen Wei, Zhang Haitao. The list can go on and on. If American advocacy for human rights and justice is to mean anything at all, the US government must do more to support these political prisoners and to hold accountable the government and individuals who so brazenly abuse their fundamental rights. We all hoped that Liu Xiaobo would one day complete his unjust prison sentence and then have more time to share his passion and energy for human rights and dignity. And also perhaps one day to have time to enjoy for himself the fruits of freedom. But instead, he is gone. To close, I want to share with you the beautiful words of Martin Luther King Jr., which he delivered in a speech in Memphis, Tennessee, on the evening before his own death. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We have got some difficult days ahead, but it really does not matter with me now, because I have been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He has allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I have looked over, and I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land.
Yang, again, thank you for your passion and precision in how you present. It's just, it couldn't be clearer, the stark difference between the gross evil of what is done by the leadership of the PRC and a man of light of Liu Xiaobo's character. So thank you for your, all three of you, thank you for bearing witness to the noble truth of this man and what he stood for. I note again in Dr. Yang, in your testimony, you pointed out that the denial of Medicare led to Liu Xiaobo's advanced liver cancer, and it was at its core a disguised death sentence. To not treat, certainly no early detection, and as you point out in your testimony, as far back as 2010, Liu Xiaobo was suspected of suffering from hepatitis B. His lawyers, and Mr. Gensler, you spoke about this many times, petitioned the government and kept asking to grant him a medical parole to get the health care, the health attention that he needed, rather than languishing in a horrific jail cell. I think the other story that needs to be told by the media globally is this whole death sentence. It wasn't like he got Johns Hopkins-like medical care or Sloan Kettering grade medical care. He was ignored. The evidence clearly suggests that they did nothing or very little. And to deny his request to go to Germany or to here to get the kind of care he needs and to turn that down shows a barbarity that just needs to be confronted aggressively. And like I said earlier, I think this needs to be the pivot to human rights in his legacy, of course, but because there are so many others who are still suffering horribly in the Laogai and throughout China's concentration camp system. And when Xi Jinping goes to Davos, talks about transparency and openness, it's a cruel joke. You know, I am glad that the administration did put China on Tier 3 for its egregious abuses with regards to sex and labor trafficking. Magnitsky needs to be fully and full-throttled in its implementation to hold individuals to account. The International Religious Freedom Act, which has China as a country of particular concern, or CPC country, carries with it at least 18 prescribed sanctions that can be very, very potent if utilized. They have not been. So my hope is that that will also be, there has to be a response to this. the likes of which we've never seen before. As you said so eloquently, Dr. Yang, a disguised death sentence. For what? For peacefully asking for fundamental freedoms and human rights. So if any of you would like to comment on this lack of medical attention, which is appalling, please do. And I do have some other questions, but any other points you would like to make as well, we would like to receive.
Mr. Chairman, I have to leave right now. Yeah.
Well, I do want to build on Global Magnitsky, and my view is, and I will work on this myself, is I'd like to put together a comprehensive list of everybody who was responsible for Liu Xiaobo's arrest, trial, imprisonment, and care or lack thereof, from the prosecutor to the judge to the person who ran his prison to the hospital where he died. It seems to me that we could put together a list of a dozen or 15 names of people that are directly responsible for what happened to him, and that should be among a number of different things that are done to send a very clear message about where the United States stands in regards to those who are actually responsible. There will be no justice and accountability, of course, for anybody in China, but there needs to be some measure of justice and accountability for Liu Xiaobo as part of his legacy, and to send a very clear signal about there being consequences to decisions that are being made at all levels of government in China. So that's what I would just have to say on Global Magnitsky.
It's worth noting, I think, that the pattern of having political prisoners die in prison in China is a pattern. It's not just that Liu Xiaobo was the first one. A few years ago, a woman named Cao Shunli, who's not nearly as famous as he is, was ground to death. She disappeared in about September 15th on her way to go to Geneva for a report on human rights in China. The police took her into prison, and she was released 6 months later in a coma, given to her family after it was clear that she would not live, but not wanting her to die in prison because the regime is afraid of that black eye on its record. I would like to make another point, though, as we remember this man. I think it's important that we, and by we I mean the whole world, recognize him as a world-class person, not just a China person. I mean, we China scholars have the problem, I think, of thinking that he speaks for China and he's talking about Chinese human rights and we're dealing with the Chinese government, and all of that is true. But he speaks to the whole world. In my statement a moment ago, I referred to Mandela and Havel and Aung San Suu Kyi, all of whom are viewed as world-class upholders of freedom and human rights, and he should be too. I noticed on the PBS TV program that announced his death last night, I was waiting to see which China scholar would come on and talk about it, but they didn't have a China scholar. They had a man from India who represented Amnesty International, and I thought that was wonderful because the point is he speaks for all of humanity, not just Chinese humanity. And in that connection, I think it's good that this subcommittee is on Africa, global health, global human rights, and international organizations. That's a very good step toward saying what Liu Xiaobo stood for is universal human rights, not just China.
Ask you, Dr. Link, you've testified before, and I appreciate your testimony you've provided us on the whole university, the 12 campuses of, like NYU, for example, Kane College, in China, on mainland China, and then all the Confucius centers.
Yes.
Has there been any response over the last 2 weeks? And we passed a resolution. I authored it. It was co-sponsored by Pelosi, so it's totally and absolutely bipartisan, and it passed unanimously in the House 2 weeks ago, calling for Liu Xiaobo and his wife and family to be able to come here or wherever they'd like to go for medical treatment. Have we heard anything on those campuses or at the Confucius centers about the life and the tremendous legacy and the work of Liu Xiaobo?
The Confucius Centers are on living, breathing U.S. campuses, and so it's certain that some people on those campuses notice these things and support them. I haven't done a survey of what the Confucius Institute's leaders themselves have done, but I feel very confident in saying that no, they wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. They get money from the Hanban in China, and without its being in written form, know that there are certain things you just don't do. You don't entertain the Dalai Lama or Liu Xiaobo or the Falun Gong problem or Tibet or Xinjiang or the Beijing massacre. There's a list of about 24 utterly untouchable topics that Confucius Institutes just don't observe.
My hope is, and we will, as the China Commission, which I also co-chair with Marco Rubio, I think it would be very timely for us to write them and ask them to raise the issue of Liu Xiaobo's widow, Xia, as a NYU Shanghai campus, and I did speak there a year ago, a little over a year ago, on human rights. And of course, Liu Xiaobo was one of the first things I said there. But they have, I think, an obligation, I would say a moral duty to speak out, because they tell us that they have academic freedom and the ability to speak in an unfettered way. And you're right, there are economic interests intertwined, but the hope would be that America's voice, and I would say not just America, a universally important, universally recognized human rights voice needs to be articulated now. There needs to be a pivot to human rights. The old days have to be over of just thinking that backdoor diplomacy and mentioning it, under your breath is going to work. It's not going to work. It has not worked. We had a number of women testify here before our committee just recently, all the wives of human rights lawyers who have been detained pursuant to that crackdown by Liu Xiaobo. By Xi Jinping, and to hear them tell their stories about, their husbands are just, and because they suffer equally. The idealism is just breathtaking, and yet they're in prison. Same way with the 5 daughters hearing that we had of all of those young Chinese daughters who couldn't even get a meeting with President Obama, and they pleaded with us to tell him, please let us talk to him face to face. He has 2 daughters. He'll understand. They never got the meeting. And they were articulate, and they were daughters that just spoke out so articulately and bravely on behalf of their dads who are suffering, like Gao Zhejiang and others. I think that's something we need to do, is to get at least these U.S. universities, which should or used to be beacons of academic freedom and human rights and inquiry, to raise the issue of Liu Xiaobo's widow and the work and legacy of Liu Xiaobo himself and Charter 08, the great manifesto.
I think it's a brilliant idea to have you or others in the Congress write to all of the American campuses, especially the prestigious ones who've accepted Confucius Institutes, first asking the question, saying a Nobel Peace Prize winner has died in police custody in China. Surely this is a topic worth note. What has your institute done about it? And then go on to ask the question, what are your plans for helping the wife?
Thank you, Dr. Link. Mr. Garrett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this meeting, and my apologies, candidly, to our guest. The timing is not the best, but obviously it coincides with this tragic loss of the life of a vocal leader for human rights around the world. It strikes me that the balance that the United States maintains with China is an interesting one, that we might be, to a greater extent than perhaps in any era in recent history, rivals, and yet we're arguably codependent upon one another economically and globally. The paramount interest of our office, and I think my constituents based on my listening, is that there would be peace and stability and that there would be a fundamental right to an opportunity extended to people in the 5th District of Virginia, the United States, and candidly globally. And so, and pardon me if I don't do service to Liu Xiaobo's name, but when a person of this magnitude exercises the moral courage which we've witnessed in this country through the statements and actions of people like Patrick Henry and Martin Luther King, Barbara Johns and Abraham Lincoln, it is indeed, as you say, something that should be taken note of by the world. While folks of my political ilk might sometimes find fault with some of the selections of the Nobel Committee, I think they could have found no more appropriate recipient than Liu Xiaobo. And one of the things that I've crusaded for as a member of the State House and now the Congress is a greater awareness by Americans of who Barbara Johns was. It was a 16-year-old girl who led a student walkout in Farmville, Virginia in the early 1950s, which really sparked the civil rights movement in Virginia, and did so at the imperilment of her own life and that of others, and did so at a time when, at a similar age, I was concerned with popping zits and whether or not I could get a prom date. And so sometimes I wonder what we do well here, what we can accomplish here. But to this end, I would say, Congressman Smith, gentlemen, folks in the room, that the more people we can get to go to Google and type in Liu Xiaobo's name and understand what he did in the face of the odds in which he did it, the more Liu Xiaobos there will be. I guess to the extent that we can help, I commend you on raising awareness and teaching about folks who we might not agree with on every single piece of subject matter, but who stand for fundamental truths that no one who is an American can deny, and that is that all people are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain rights. And so I suppose I'll take my time here to query both of you what, again, within the purview of the legislative branch of the United States federal government, we can do to ensure that his legacy doesn't die with his physical body, to insist that an important trade partner and member of the world community, China, understands that we give a damn, pardon me, and to encourage greater freedom and opportunity across the globe, and do so wherever practicable and possible without bombs and bullets and missiles and rockets, but brave men and women who are willing to stand up in the face of potential imprisonment or worse. So I'd offer first Mr. Genser the floor for suggestions. What can we do within the purview of Article 1 to help perpetuate the legacy of this great leader, to convey to our Chinese partners that we care, that we will not sit by idly as members of, say, for example, the Falun Gong are imprisoned on the eve of what was supposed to be a meeting with U.S. leadership. What can we do to abate my fear that when spouses of imprisoned dissidents show up before this committee, they've only made their family's circumstance worse?
Well, thanks, Congressman Garrett, for your remarks, with which I fully agree, and your commitment to human rights as well. Let me just mention a couple of things that I think are important that the Congress could be particularly involved in helping. The first, of course, and most importantly, is to help get Liu Xia and her brother out of China as rapidly as possible. We need to restore access to them and then confirm their wishes and get them out. And that should be a top priority. And I think that pressure by having this hearing today, pressure by moving a bill that's focused on Liu Xia and her brother. We've also been talking about a private member's bill that would give them legal permanent resident status immediately upon arriving in the United States. These are things Congress can do. So that would be number one. Number two, Liu Xiaobo Plaza, renaming the street in front of the Chinese embassy for Liu Xiaobo, I think is a way that the United States and governments all over the world, and I'm sure we'll be campaigning for this, for all countries in the world to rename the streets in front of the Chinese embassy Liu Xiaobo Plaza. This is something that obviously has to go through the Congress and then go to the President for signature. Number 3, justice and accountability, and I was just mentioning as well, having a list of those responsible for Liu Xiaobo and Liu Sha's deaths, to have the Congress advocating, to have them sanctioned under Global Magnitsky, and to make clear that this is why they're being sanctioned. And then let me just step back broadly and make a final point, which is something that I've spent my career as a human rights lawyer fighting for the freedom of prisoners of conscience. I spent 5 years as Aung San Suu Kyi's International Counsel. I've represented more than 40 prisoners of conscience over my career and founded Freedom Now, my NGO, on whose board I sit, which has a full-time staff in Washington and London to work on these cases. One of the things I think the U.S. needs to do more directly, and I think the Congress could play a key role in a legislative context, is to focus our foreign policy on the world's prisoners of conscience, right? Because it seems to me that, we have annual human rights reports, and that's really good, and prisoners of conscience are kind of a narrow piece of it, but a more focused set of activities for the United States to focus on prisoners of conscience, because what we have found historically, and we were talking about a lot of different, obviously names, people like Havel, people like Mandela, is that the prisoners of conscience of today are the leaders of their countries tomorrow, and that for the United States to stand in solidarity with homegrown pro-democracy activists, not the United States imposing our values or our form of government onto others, but embracing those that within their own countries see the value of democracy, the value of human freedom, and to systematically, as part of our foreign policy and engaging with every country in the world, any country that is persecuting prisoners of conscience, our engagement with that country, not just from the State Department or the National Security Council, but from every agency, can be focused on a list of names that would be raised, focused on training foreign service officers to do these kinds of things, focused on reporting requirements for the State Department about what's being done to help these people. What's interesting is that if you look at the case of Natan Sharansky, who of course was a Soviet dissident whose wife, Avital, met with President Reagan. A mentor of mine in my career, Erwin Kotler, was his counsel, and had a chance to talk to Gorbachev about why did you release Natan Sharansky. And what Gorbachev said was really telling and I think really, really important, which was to say that, well, I didn't know who this guy, Natan Sharansky, was until and many years before he became the president of the Soviet Union. He was an agricultural minister of agriculture, and he came to the United States on some kind of agricultural exchange and discussion about, well, agricultural issues. And yet, on the U.S. side, our agriculture secretary raised to him Natan Sharansky's name in a meeting about agriculture. And one of the first things he did when he became president, he told my friend and mentor Erwin Kotler, was to ask the secret police, the KGB, for the file of Natan Sharansky, because he had heard about this in many meetings with U.S. government officials over and over and over again, and like, why is the agricultural secretary doing this? And he looked at the file and he's like, well, this makes no sense. Why is this guy in jail? And ultimately he was released. And so, to me, that's an important lesson for the United States, that prisoners of conscience and helping people of this sort isn't just the responsibility of some narrow assistant secretary for democracy, labor, and human rights to be raising, but that it has to be part and parcel and central to U.S. foreign policy as a strategic tactic to be regularly deployed to try to advance human freedom around the world. So let me conclude.
So to some degree, the Sharansky case was almost a ye have not because ye ask not. The attention was all that was. One thing that I was probably unintelligently voiced my frustration with, and I've only been here for a short time, is that I don't feel that we have synergy between the executive and the legislative as it relates to working together. I don't feel, sometimes I feel, and we've worked on the release of some prisoners of conscience, particularly in the southern Nuba Mountain regions of the Republic of the Sudan, and I almost feel like State Department wants to know why I care. God bless the good men and women there. I don't want to, but I mean, we should be working together to advance the same goals, and wherever any human being is held prisoner based on beliefs, unless those beliefs advocate violence against other humans, why can't we all agree on that, right? So thank you immensely, and I would love to speak to you briefly after the hearing about what you do, because I think we might be able to help to the same, I think, admirable goal. The only thing that I've been able to do in 6 months here that I can take pride in and take to my grave is help affect the release of individuals held because of their beliefs, right? It's hard to pass a bill, but when you tell somebody the United States of America is looking and cares about some formerly nameless individual in prison because of their faith or their actions of humanity towards another, and something happens, then you go, maybe this is all worth it. Thanks for what you do. Dr. Link, what else, within the context of the legislative role of, the Article 1 constitutional underpinnings of this body, should we be doing that we're not doing? And by the way, I texted my legislative director during your comments to get us on the bill that is out there as it relates to the plaza. I just, Liu Xiaobo Plaza. I'm wholly cognizant of my inability to properly pronounce certain things.
Let me add my voice to the chorus that says that the Liu Xiaobo Plaza is a great idea. I really strongly endorse that. And also endorse what my colleague Jared Genzer said in some more detail about focus of foreign policy on prisoners of conscience. I think it's often perceived that we do that because it makes us feel better, and that's good. We should feel better. It's right to do the right thing, and we're better people for doing it. But what he's pointed out is that it's also an investment in practical terms in a better world, because these people that we're helping emerge, Havel did, Mandela did, Aung San Suu Kyi did, Liu Xiaobo can't, but there are more. It's a good investment from a practical point of view. I would add a third, which Jared sort of mentioned, but I would put it this way, and that's the bully pulpit is a good thing to use. It sounds like we're just pontificating, preaching, and so on, and that there might be backlash. But I think that's not right. Even the leaders, even the oppressors in China, at another level, know that democracy and human rights are a good thing. Watch the way they put the word democracy in their own rhetoric. Stalin, Lenin said they had democratic centralism. Mao Zedong said it was democratic centralism. North Korea, the most repugnant state on the face of the globe today, calls itself the Democratic Republic. There is a two-leveledness in the psychology of the oppressors. They want it both ways. Underneath, on the surface, the West is bad, the West's values are not universal, and they're oppressing us and so on, but I'm going to send my daughter to Harvard. Xi Jinping's daughter went there. Send them money. I'm from California. The Los Angeles area is full of communities that are built on money, probably corrupt money, shipped from China, that the privileged elite in China wants to ship abroad. They send their kids to go to U.S. schools more and more and more. So what does this say? Does this say that they hate Western values? No. It's a rivalrous feeling, and at one level they say we're all against you, but at another level, we're sending our children and our money to your country for safekeeping. So that gives us a platform on which to say, without apology, democracy, freedom, human rights are good things. And they may say on the surface, no, that's Western imperialism. Underneath, they know it's not. A lot of them know it's not. Therefore, I think what I've just called the bully pulpit, when our officials go to the G20 meetings, when they go to the United Nations, or through VOA and Radio Free Asia, don't be embarrassed to put our values out there. There's more to them than the tyrants in China want to admit.
Thank you, Dr. Link. I would beg the chairman's indulgence for another question that's tangentially related and not directly related, but your comments have got the wheels turning a little bit. There is some call from various sectors in order to exert pressure on the Chinese, to exert pressure on North Korea, consider rolling back admissions of Chinese students to U.S. universities. My immediate reaction is that we don't have a Sisi in Egypt if there's not a period of learning and experiencing American culture, that we don't have any number of leaders abroad who've turned out to be pretty good allies if they hadn't spent time here in the United States. So there's back-end value to having the children, even of the Chinese ruling class, in American institutions. Right. Having said that, the secondary argument is, you know, there is a rivalry, there is a need for engineers and software developers and expertise, and there is a competitive nature to it, whether we like it or not. And institutions are producing the young women and men who are beating us at our own game, if you will. I would love your opinion on the idea that somehow denying access to our universities might advance goals as it relates to human rights and stability and safety on the Korean Peninsula, and as it relates to geopolitical stability and security, which might manifest itself differently based on the regions from which our excellent young students might matriculate. And this is an opinion question. There are no wrong answers.
As a broad principle, I would say that it's good for us to take the children of anybody, if they're smart enough to get through the universities and do well, and that the long-range effects of a U.S. education on the children of the Chinese elite is a good thing, and I work in a university. I make certain exceptions for that, though. About a week ago, a Wall Street Journal columnist named Bill McGurn called me up, and he asked me what I thought of targeting the offspring of the super elite in China and denying them visas to come to Harvard and Stanford and Chicago as a method of getting leverage for China to cooperate on North Korea. And I said, I think that's a good idea. So there's an exception there to my broader principle. And I would just say I make that exception because it's well known that we have no good options on North Korea. You know, if you bomb an attack, that's going to wreak havoc. It's going to destroy the city of Seoul. If you just do what we've done for the last 3 decades, which is to cross your fingers and hope for the best, that's not working either. What can we do? China, of course, can play a key role. That would be the way to really bring pressure on the North Korean regime. But China won't. I think the Chinese leadership likes their position of being able to waffle and have us constantly begging them to help, and they say they will, but then they don't, and so on. That's their end game. They like that. So when Bill McGurn asked me, is this a way to get the top leaders' attention in a very personal way, I said yes, and I would make that exception. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't want to, Mr. Genser, if you have any comments to that end, I'd welcome them. I don't want to freeze you out here.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Perry on this. I think as a strategic question overall, I think the more that we can expose foreigners to U.S. universities, the more that our system of government, the system, the free market, our values will be transmitted. But you know, you look at certain countries in the world who send their leaders send their kids to the United States, and you may have a different take on it. So, for example, let's take Iran, right? You know, it was reported in the media about a year and a half ago that the woman who was actually the spokesperson for the students who took the U.S. Embassy in '79, Masuma Ebtekar, who was referred to as Mary back then as the spokeswoman, her son is getting his PhD in California, and she is the sitting vice president of Iran and the head of their EPA, and has been an unrepentant person with respect to everything relating to the United States, and including her role in taking American hostages. Do I think it's a good idea to allow someone like that to have their child educated in the United States? Not really. My view is that while ordinarily I would never want to punish a child for the sins of their father or mother, in a case like that, where the person is a sitting senior leader and is an unrepentant hostage taker, I don't think that we should be opening up our borders freely to people like that. And I would note as well that among my other clients are Siamak and Bakir Namazi, 2 American citizen hostages in Iran, 2 of 4 currently. And so Iran isn't just historically having taken hostages, but it is doing so today, and the current government of Iran, and in particularly the Revolutionary Guard Corps, are responsible for that. So it does seem to me that, that one needs to be smart about this and not just go with a big hammer and say, well, let's just not let people in. But I think that strategically the United States can definitely use access to our university system to send targeted messages in the right way and in the right time.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'll wrap up. So in conclusion, I would ask the yes or no question. The succinct summary of what you said is, if we target specific individuals and paint with a very narrow brush, that there can be an effective outcome. If we paint with a broad brush and essentially say we're not going to have students from country X, it's probably deleterious to our long-term desires.
Correct.
Yes.
Thank you guys immensely. And again, Mr. Genser, if you'll stick around for a little bit, I'd be grateful.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garrett. And I'll just conclude and ask if you have any final statements that you would like to make before we end the hearing. Just for the record, Senator Cruz's bill to rename International Drive Liu Xiaobo's Plaza has been hotlined in the Senate. Unfortunately, it has a couple of holds on it, and that is the way the Senate works. One member can hold up a bill, but it is being actively pursued there. And Mark Meadows, a member of our subcommittee, has introduced H.R. 2537 to rename Liu Xiaobo Plaza, and our hope is as soon as that can get approved, the better. And I'm very proud to be one of the co-sponsors following his lead on that. Just one brief point, about a whole of government approach. We recently enacted the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, and one of the main parts of that legislation was to have a whole of government approach so that you don't get a human rights dialogue that becomes an end unto a means unto an end, where it's like a cul-de-sac. Everyone talks, everybody leaves. There's no connection to anything else. We need the U.S. trade representative. We need people in the military, particularly when there's a government-to-government contact of some kind, to almost like, as you pointed out with the Ag Secretary and Natan Sharansky, or Ag officials, that they realize that every time they turn around, a group of noble dissidents are being named as being high priority to the United States. When you don't do that, that speaks volumes as well. So that Religious Freedom Act also has prisoners lists by country, which I think has been long overlooked. Some of the dissidents in the political sphere get good mention by the Department of Human Rights, Labor and Human Rights, which is good. But again, it often stops there. So we need this whole of government approach so that everyone, and that would go for members of Congress as well, that when we travel, we don't go to China and fail to bring up, particularly if you meet with a leader, the names, and the more specific, the better. I'll never forget, Frank Wolf and I met with Li Peng back in the 1990s. And our delegation, he and I and our staff, were merged with a trade delegation. Thankfully, we got the seats closest to Li Peng, Premier. And we raised the issues specifically of names, Tiananmen Square names, went through religious freedom, forced abortion. We laid out a human rights case. He sat there almost bewildered, who let these two guys in? But the whole discussion was about that. The next day, he met with another group from America, and he launched into a tirade about democracy and how they protect democracy. And he was all on defensive mode because they have much to be ashamed of. These are willful actions taken. What they did to Liu Xiaobo, what they continue to do to his wife, is by design, not by default. And so we need to hold them to account. And my hope is that this new administration will do a whole of government approach. And lastly, I learned a lesson from Wei Jingsheng when he was briefly led out of prison to procure Olympics 2000 for China. They eventually got it in 2008, but they wanted it in 2000. A high-value political prisoner, father of the Democracy Wall movement, spent 18 years in prison. He went back in after we met and had dinner together, not right away, but when they didn't get Olympics 2000. He said, everybody in America and in policymaking around the world need to understand that when you kowtow, they beat us more in the prison. It follows right through into the prison cell itself, and those who administer torture and other horrible misdeeds against prisoners. When you are tough, predictable, look them in the eyes and say, we know what you're doing, we know what you've been doing to Liu Xiaobo all these years, and you bring it up every time, they beat us less and they treat us better. And people do get out of prison. They often go on parole, but they're at least home. And so, again, this pivot to human rights in China, that the horrific death sentence of Liu Xiaobo, it is now that Western governments led by the United States need to say, now we are all in the legacy and the great pioneering work that was done by Liu Xiaobo. So if you'd like to conclude, or Mr. Garrett wants to conclude with any statement, I just yield to my friends at the witness table.
I'll tell one anecdote to reinforce the point you just made. My wife is Chinese, and she was a protester in the 1989 events and was sent to a labor camp for 3 years. And she had also studied law, and she looked up the law, and it says in the law of the labor camps that you can labor only 8 hours a day, and they were having to labor 14 hours a day. So she said, no, I'm only going to do 8 hours a day. And so the prison authorities organized a group of other prisoners to beat her, and they did. And this was terrible. She suffered beatings. She snuck out a note via another prisoner who was leaving to her mother. Her mother told Human Rights Watch in New York. Human Rights Watch publicized her case, and immediately the beating stopped, and she only had to work 8 hours a day.
I'll end with an anecdote that is a tragic anecdote, but a reason, I think, for further motivation for us to proceed full force on all of these issues, which is that over the years I've been in touch with many human rights lawyers in China and worked with many of them as well. And obviously I can't provide any names here publicly, but there have been a number of human rights lawyers I know that have been vigorously interrogated by Chinese authorities, beaten, and treated very badly, some of whom, of course, have been sent to prison, others not. But unfortunately, Liu Xiaobo's name has been invoked by the torturers in torturing individual people in China in recent years. And this is when they're trying to persuade a human rights lawyer who maybe hasn't been as aggressive yet as somebody like a Gao Zhisheng, where they are, as they're beating them, they say, this is pointless. You're never going to succeed standing up to the one-party system. And, you know, look at the case of Liu Xiaobo, the world's only imprisoned Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and we're holding his wife with impunity, right? The world knows who he is and can't do anything about it. What hope do you have of standing up to our government? You should just give up right now, right? And this is the refrain that the torturers use as they torture people or certain people in China. And to me, this is both unsurprising and equally horrific at the same time. But this only reaffirms why we need to do everything humanly possible to keep Liu Xiaobo's memory alive and to stand in solidarity with the prisoners of conscience whose names Yang Zhenli was mentioning earlier, as well as the countless hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of others we don't really even know that are suffering. We can't let the anonymous prisoner of conscience be forgotten in China. Because they will do whatever they would like to them. And I think that the case of Liu Xiaobo will also be remembered, I think in the best sense, for being hopefully a line in the sand where the international community is able to say to China, enough, enough. We are mutually interdependent, as I think Congressman Garrett was saying, on trade, on intellectual property, on North Korea, Iran, all the things we have to work on. And China can't afford to walk away from its relationship with the United States because it gets angry with the United States for raising human rights. It isn't going to happen under any circumstance. And they're not going to dump our $1 trillion plus of treasuries either, because they're smart and they do not want to lose a lot of money. So they're forced to deal with us on human rights, and why the international community has engaged in so much self-censorship, to me, boggles my mind. I also agree, I just want to conclude by noting what Chairman Smith was saying about these human rights dialogues. I've always joked that, based on friends of mine who have been in them on the U.S. side, and I've heard stories about how they go, that these actually aren't human rights dialogues, they're really human rights sequential monologues. And maybe the Congress could force the administration to call them that, right? We're no longer going to have dialogues with human rights dialogues with China. We're going to require them to be publicly labeled human rights sequential monologues if we're going to keep doing them, because it's not like either side is giving anything, and the Chinese side especially is just giving speeches that are prepared and aren't able to do anything at all. So I also, as well, want to conclude by thanking particularly Chairman Smith. I'm obviously also grateful for Mr. Garrett, but particularly Chairman Smith for your commitment over decades on China human rights. You have just been indefatigable, relentless, and are such an extraordinary champion here in the Congress on China rights issues, along with Leader Pelosi and others. But the fact that this subcommittee is so focused on China and so focused on human rights more broadly, I don't know what we would do without you, Mr. Chairman, being here and your leadership. And so it's always a pleasure to appear before you, and thank you for everything you're doing as well.
Thank you. You know, you keep saying stuff that makes me want to say more stuff, so I apologize. It's so frustrating, so earlier I believe the IRGC was mentioned in the context of Iran and some of the 4 Americans currently being held by that regime, which obviously as soon as they released a certain subset of Americans found some more Americans to hold. And it strikes me that the regime is undergird, obviously, and we're talking about Iran, not China now, but we're on the same subject, which is global human rights, and by the perpetuation of the IRGC and specifically the Quds Force thereof. Any group of people willing to shoot their brothers and sisters in the face in the street is a difficult obstacle to overcome when you choose to exercise peaceful means of protest for expanded human rights. But what you said that sort of struck a vein was that the Chinese are not going to turn their backs and walk away from us because they're frustrated that we've discussed human rights. So too, I would argue that if you remove the money that supports the IRGC, which supports the Quds subset thereof, and arguably Hezbollah globally, that you will see a climate wherein things like the Green Revolution are more likely to be successful. And so I will take this opportunity to chide the nameless masses who are more concerned with losing money by virtue of the termination of trade relationships with entities like the IRGC, or in some instances even China, than they are with people who have done more to perpetuate human rights and individual dignity and honor than they ever will. That if we stood up with a unified voice and said to the world, you can do business with the United States of America or the IRGC, for example, that the world would choose to do business with the United States of America, and millions of good Iranian people who yearn to have self-determination and freedom and wish to exercise tolerance towards their brothers and sisters could be the leaders therein. So keep doing what you're doing. I think the reason there's no more hue and cry, candidly, is because folks like Chris Smith, who've been at this for years, folks like Frank Wolf, who's somebody I genuinely admire, were unable to get the message to a broad enough subset. But there's nothing in Washington, D.C. that I can find that transcends political partisanship, like the concept that every human being is entitled to a basic level of dignity and self-determination. And I think we can do things. I really do. But I think we need to make hard choices and say, you know what, this revenue today, this money today, this business opportunity today will be there tomorrow. But right now we need to say no because there are greater things at stake. So I thank you all for what you do. It's an honor to sit here next to you. And hopefully we can get more people aware of circumstances like these, because I think without ever dropping a bomb or firing a gun, we can bring change that frees human beings who have an inherent God-given, in my opinion, right to self-determination and freedom. Thank you immensely, and look forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you, Chairman Smith.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Garrett, for your very eloquent summation and your questioning. Let me just If I could ask you all to join me in a moment of prayerful silence for Liu Xiaobo. The hearing is adjourned.